Well, welcome everyone to Angelicum Conversations. This is a new media initiative of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum in Rome, where we are hosting conversations on topics of philosophy, theology, and culture through the format of conversation. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, Professor Andrew Meszaros, who I will introduce. We are speaking about John Henry Newman, Doctor of the Church. The Church has recently declared that he is to be made a doctor, having already been canonized some years ago. And so we want to talk a little bit about why he's going to be made a doctor of the church. Who was John Henry Newman? What's the greatness and importance of his life and his theological teaching? Dr. Meszaros is joining us as a new professor of the Angelicum, who's recently moved here from elsewhere and is an expert in the thought of John Henry Newman. Among other things, as he'll probably tell us, he contributed to paperwork for the Vatican to consider the cause of him being made a doctor, and he's taking up the first chair of John Henry Newman studies at the Angelicum. So we're excited and happy to have him with us. So, this is a kind of conversation. I'll probably say some things, he'll say some things, and we'll get into vigorous debate or not. So, but let me start by just asking the most basic of questions to you, Andrew. Who was St. John Henry Newman? What can you tell us a little bit about his life and his profile?
Thanks a lot for that, Father, and thanks for inviting me. Briefly, John Henry Newman was one of the foremost churchmen of the 19th century, both in terms of his Anglican identity and his Catholic identity. In the grand scheme of things, I would list him up there with Venerable Bede, who was already a doctor of the church. And then you have also people like St. Anselm of Canterbury. And then you have, in the 19th century, John Henry Newman. And in the English-speaking world, I would say he's the foremost churchman. Catholic thinker, Anglican thinker. And I suppose what makes him most famous for our purposes, or most significant for our purposes, is the journey that he made from his Anglican upbringing and to his full embrace of the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith.
He basically lives like the 19th century.
Born in 1801 and lives all the way to 1890. So the 19th century is his century.
And he converts in the middle of his life.
Yeah. So most biographers divide up his life into two. So his conversion happens in 1845, which is almost right in the middle. And so we divide up his life into the Anglican period on the one hand and then the Catholic period on the other. And obviously there's continuities in his thought and his principles, which gives kind of a flavor and a drama and a dynamic to his path in life. But overall, there's definitely two identifiable parts in his life, the Anglican and the Catholic.
Would it be fair to say in the first half of his life, when he converted at the University of Oxford in the mid 19th century, he was one of, if not the most foremost Anglican theologians of his time. And then, as a Catholic, he matures into one of, if not the foremost Catholic thinker of the 19th century. Or is that fair to say?
Yeah. Not to be too nitpicky, but he would never have considered himself a theologian. And so he even repudiates that word. He said, I'm not a theologian. Even as a Catholic, he said, I'm not a theologian.
So he can't be a doctor of the church. He's himself repudiated the title.
I'm not a theologian, he says. And he never actually studied formal theology, but he did do a ton of reading in patristics, antiquities, classics, etc. And he actually studied maths early on in his days at Trinity. But basically, he became a leader of the Oxford movement. So he's one of the foremost voices in the 19th century in the Oxford movement. But prior to that, I should just begin, he started as an Anglican. He was born Anglican, and had his first conversion, as it were, at the age of 15, where he says he has this sense of dogmatic content, of truth, dogmatic truth, and he has a profound sense of his relationship with God, himself and his creator. And so from then on, he knew that his religion was not going to be a religion of sentiment. It was going to be a dogmatic religion. It had content. He believed in revelation.
Well, I think his style is not that of, say, a scholastic or even a patristic theologian. It's not as didactic. It's a little more, interior, spiritual, autobiographical, or maybe a kind of meditative, ruminative style, but he's a doctrinal thinker. So, in a way, the delivery system is different, but the content has a very theological feel to it.
Yeah.
He cares about dogma.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes him special, is that he combines, for example, dogmatic content with a more existential, personal delivery, and tries to, whatever he says, he tries to resonate with the people to whom he is speaking.
Okay, so that's a good transition. So why is he important today? Why is he popular among Catholic theologians and more often just lay people who read him avidly? And why is the church making him a doctor of the church at this time? What do you think is the importance
Yeah.
of that?
Well, I think like any Catholic thinker and any theologian, whether you're a doctor or not, so to the extent that you're saying the truth, what you say is always going to be relevant because truth is always relevant. But I think his moment is very close to our moment. Obviously, the 19th century has made differences to, to our contemporary context. We're in a postmodern world, and he was in the middle of modernity. But in the basic way of life, culture, where there's still a positivism that reigns, there's still a materialism that reigns, there's still a rationalism that reigns. And so what it meant to be a rational Englishman is very much akin to what it means to be a rational,
okay, so
reasonable person today.
that's excellent. Let me just push back, or like maybe even try to strengthen that point, because you say he's modern, we're postmodern. But, as you know, he gave the Biglietto speech the night before he was named a cardinal by the Pope toward the end of his life, and he said, "My whole life I have labored against liberalism in matters of religion." And when he defines that, he talks about it as the primacy of private judgment, a kind of subjectivism that each person can kind of make up the truth for themselves, find the truth on their own terms, independent of real authorities and authentic, you might say, truth-bearing teaching that's outside of ourselves. Isn't that kind of a postmodern dimension of modernity to say that everyone can have their own truth, and he's fighting that, or as it were, is contesting that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the major continuities between modernity and postmodernity, is that we become the authors of, or we become the final arbiter of whatever truth, so we judge. I think the big difference is that I think there was a great optimism in the 19th century about a universal reason, and everyone believed what it meant to be a reasonable Englishman, which was basically empiricist and positivist. Whereas today, what it means to be reasonable is a bit more ambiguous.
So it's easier to be a disciple of Newman now, maybe,
Today,
than it was at
I
his
would
time.
say so.
He was maybe more a pioneer, a prophet, and maybe more heroic, and easier. It's easier to see a lot of the projects of modernity have wilted after the vanities of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think reason was in a straitjacket in the 19th century, and Newman tried to break open the straitjacket and say that we can reason in a different way than you guys might think we have to reason, or what it means to act reasonably or think reasonably means something different.
And I mean, his Anglican period opens him to this, right? Because when he's an Anglican, he's teaching the church fathers at Oxford, he's reading ancient sources, and he's thinking about how antiquity is a resource for thinking about the transcendent mystery of God in the world today, the absolute mystery of Christ, the mystery of the church. So in a way, he's, not anachronistic, but he's finding in the past a heritage that he wants to bring into the present, and that creates, in a way, a tension with the secular ambient milieu, even in Oxford Anglicanism.
Yeah, his discovery of the church fathers is one of the key moments in his path towards finding the Catholic faith. So interestingly, at the age of 15, he had his first conversion to dogma, and then he discovers the fathers, and he realizes that actually his Protestantism, or his evangelical upbringing, or not upbringing, or his evangelical conversion, is inadequate, and that he tries to discover what Catholic truth is, and he sees that what the church fathers are saying is something quite different to what he experiences as a Protestant in England. So then this Oxford movement begins. He reads the fathers, and then crisis hits, right? Because he starts seeing the ancient controversies of old, and he sees them reflected in the 19th century. So he'll see.
To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant, is his famous line.
Right. Yeah. He reads the Chalcedonian Council and the Monophysites, and he says, wait a minute, the Anglicans look like they're the Monophysites here. Rome has an active role to play in the council. Another Pope Leo, the first Pope Leo, has a very active role. St. Augustine, to whom all the Protestants were lauding and was the champion for salvation by faith and grace. The St. Augustine is also appealing to Rome and defending the papacy. And so through all of this, Newman's eyes are opened, and he realizes, wait a minute, where I am right now is not where I should be, and I can't really condemn Monophysites and Eutychians and not at the same time condemn, for example, Anglicans today. So he found that there was a parallel in the shortcomings ecclesiologically.
So this touches on the next question I want to ask, which is sort of about the fact that a doctor of the church is also a saint. In Newman, there's a search for clarity and truth and holiness, and a holiness of life that go along with his, academic and intellectual search. So he was converted in part from the experience of a saint, the encounter with a saint, and he himself, of course, went on to live a life of profound holiness. Can you say a little bit about this aspect of his itinerary?
Are you referring to the Passionist priest, Barbary?
Yeah.
Yeah, Down Father
right.
Brown. Yeah, so he was converted. Yeah, so Barbary was basically a missionary in England. And at first, Newman was actually quite dismissive, and he had a very anti-Italian, anti-Catholic prejudice. And he thought, well, if these guys are going to come to England, they better start preaching and walking the walk. Otherwise, I won't accept or I won't take them seriously. And a couple of years later, he actually took the plunge and went to that same man and converted.
And Barbary is a blessed, I believe. I mean,
Yeah.
so he was a witness to a life of great personal holiness and friendship with Christ. And when Newman encountered this,
taking a number of risks, ridicule, standing up in full habit, preaching, and there was a lot of motions around England to kind of dissuade people from listening to him. So Anglicans would be knocking on people's doors, telling them not to listen to the Passionist priest. And so he took a lot of ridicule, and I think Newman respected that. And actually, even after his conversion, thought very highly and was devastated when Barbary passed away. I think maybe 5 years or 4 years after he received Newman into the church.
He passed the baton, though. He did. And Newman founded the oratory in England, inspired by Philip Neri, St. Philip Neri, right?
Yeah, so he enters the church in 45, he goes to Rome, and then the question is, well, do I want to become a priest? Yes, I do want to become a priest. And then he has a conversation with Nicholas Wiseman, who at the time was another English cleric who helped reestablish the Catholic hierarchy in England, which didn't exist for centuries since the Reformation. And it was Wiseman who thought, well, maybe you should start an oratory. And if you actually go into St. Peter's Basilica, which I was in just the other day, you see these two great 16th century saints in the middle of the nave, St. Ignatius on the left and St. Philip Neri on the right. And of course, St. Philip Neri is buried here in Rome, the apostle of Rome.
Patron saint of Rome.
Yeah.
A person of amazing joy and piety, a confessor, a person who led young people on pilgrimage. So, a person who celebrated the faith in a very public way to try to reform the practice of religion in the 16th century in Rome. So Newman, who was a more serious person and certainly a more introverted person, kind of found a colleague and inspiration in like the more extroverted and joyful, manifestly joyful life of Philip Neri. It's a very interesting pairing, two different temperaments.
No, absolutely. As you say, he was apostle of joy, and he had a humor about him. And I think, like Chesterton says that every generation is converted by the most countercultural saint of the moment. I'm paraphrasing here. And I think Newman, in that sense, was converted by Philip Neri, who had a very different disposition. And in a different way, Newman himself had a very different disposition to the 19th century in which he lived. And so I think there's a beautiful parallel there in terms of his journey into the Catholic faith and then his embrace of the oratory.
So you're saying psychological profiling is not that useful for canonizing saints or understanding who is culturally prophetic? You can have a contrary temperament and still be productive.
That's actually helpful.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's hope for that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about his theological contributions, because he is, after all, a doctor of the church, so there's doctrine. And of course, on that point, the most famous book he wrote is on the development of doctrine. And when people think of Newman as a theologian, it's the first thing they think of. It's what you've written on most about his work, and it's where he continues to be studied and read. He wrote about historical development of doctrine and what that might mean, and what are some notes and criteria of authentic development of the faith down through time in a doctrinally organic and, you might say, homogeneous and continual way, versus a corruption of dogma or doctrine when things go off track and rupture with the past. And can you talk to us a little bit about that idea, or what you see going on in his work?
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, we think about doctrinal development all the time because we realize that things look different now than they did a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. And for us, it might be kind of a matter of theological interest. For Newman, it was not just that. It was, for him, something incredibly existential. So he felt that his salvation was linked to finding the Catholic truth, and he needed to go about and find it. And so for him, development was a way of explaining how the church, whether Anglican or Catholic, looked very different from the Apostolic Church. Things develop, the liturgy develops, the way we preach develops, our theology develops, the papacy develops. And so he came to realize in writing this book in 1845 that what he thought were corruptions in the Roman system, as he called it, were actually could be explained as authentic developments rather than corruptions as he thought that they were.
And this is because everything can change all the time completely, and the Catholic Church can contradict itself from
Yeah,
1 year time.
Development's a free for all. You could do whatever you want. No, just kidding. So he has. So we notice that there's change, and the question is it an authentic change or is it a corruption? And so Newman famously puts forward 7 notes. He originally called them tests, and then he kind of loosened it up a bit to call them marks or notes of authentic developments. And I can enumerate some of them, but basically something like continuity of principle, or preservation of or conservation of a past doctrine, or its assimilative power. Does it assimilate things? Does it conserve what came before it? Does it anticipate some future development? Does
It's
it have
all continuity language, right?
These are
I
all
mean, a lot
yeah.
of this, also logical consistency down through time.
Logical sequence is
Yeah,
another
logical
one,
sequence.
and chronic vigor.
Mhm.
Heresies die, they wither, and if they don't wither, and if they keep going, there's some other reason for why they keep going, and they're usually buttressed by the state, for example.
Okay, so let me just say, I see I think this is very important. You're rightly noting 2 kind of very different dimensions this takes right away. On the one side, like we look at history, we see immense change in the Catholic Church down through time, and things that could have looked very normative here look less normative there. What didn't seem to be emergent there has emerged here. And on the other side, then when he looks at that, he's also really seeking some kinds of criteria of continuity, continually active principles, ways that the past anticipates the future, or the future conserves the past, ways that you have to think in a coherent way across time and all this. So, I mean, there's tension there. I mean, that's a really rich and at the same time challenging idea that we're going to have something that's continuous all the way through, and we're going to admit and, in fact, in a way, embrace the fact that there's a lot of vibrant change and alternative activity down through time.
Yeah. I think the tension really lies between not so much, there's continuity and discontinuity, but I think it's between, say, a divinely providential, dogmatic clarification and deepening of understanding on the part of the church on the one hand, and the concrete historical causes that lead to this clarification. And so if you only examine the concrete historical causes, you can easily slip into a kind of historicism whereby all the developments in the church are simply a result of some kind of
Absolutely
cause.
accidental, like historical contingent causes that come and go. We know what it's really about. The church is just basically a human political set of machinations that are arbitrary down through time. And what you're saying is that's level is sort of there, but through it, the church is actually seeing into a deep set of principles that are consistent over time that emerge through those debates.
Newman sees the messiness of ecumenical councils.
Yeah.
He sees the machinations. He doesn't, he acknowledges them, but he sees more in them. Yeah, and he sees that, like, orthodoxy, for example, is not just who's the winner at the end of the day, but orthodoxy is actually truth, and that God can actually communicate the truth and can help the church penetrate that truth over time through the messiness of fallible human agents.
The divine truth is being revealed through limited and, in some cases, imperfect or sinful human beings.
Exactly.
But it is being revealed and being provided for through history. So, talking about fallible human beings, Newman also wrote a lot about the conscience in his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk. He was a great defender of the human conscience. He talked about toasting the conscience. I toast the Pope, but conscience first. And he, in the apologia about his own life and his religious opinions, is clearly a person who wanted to follow the sacred intuitions of the Holy Spirit impressed into his conscience. So, is he a subjectivist? I mean, this is another point of famous controversy. I mean, is he exalting the conscience over the external voice of the church? What's the relationship there? Why is conscience so important?
Yeah, I think, like doctrinal development, conscience is one of those things where different studiers or scholars of Newman can take him in different ways, and he can be taken in different directions. So I think the most interesting thing about Newman and conscience is that it's more than just a moral category. For him, it's the foundational element. It's where our religious experiences with God begins. It's the foundation for our religious journey to heaven. Without conscience and having that experience of God, everything, you wouldn't be able to, for example, recognize revelation. You wouldn't know that God is speaking to you through Christ and his Son if you actually had no notion of who God is to begin with. And so, like many people, they look into the world and you can
it's
look
sort
at
of
5
his
ways.
natural theology.
It's his natural theology. And so some people would look at the 5 ways, or they look into the world, they see design or perfection or whatever it might be, beauty. But for Newman, he looked into the world and that worried him. He saw poverty and sin, and he thought, what am I meant to make of this? Whereas in the same way that a Thomist might ask, whence comes existence, or what can account for the existence of things, Newman would say, what can account for my experience of duty? I have a sense of duty. I have a moral sense. What can account for my sense of guilt or the happiness that I feel when I fulfill the moral law? What can
And he
account for
talks
that?
about hearing the voice of God in his soul and then looking out at the secular world. He says, it's like I looked into a mirror and I did not see my own face, because in the intimate cell of his conscience, he has this intimate sense of God's moral law. But when he looks out in the world, it's not corresponding. This is
Yeah.
actually this reminds me a little of later in C.S. Lewis, where the
Yeah.
conscience has a
Well,
similar kind of.
that antagonism, you might say, between what he knows in his soul with vis-a-vis God and the goodness and the beauty and the truth that he encounters with God, and looking out into the world, is what elicits in him an expectation for the gospel. Ultimately, he recognizes his own sinfulness. He recognizes the fallenness of the world, and that elicits in us an expectation and a hope that God might actually come to address this problem.
This is a great message for in the social media age. You look at social media, you don't always see the human being in its most brilliant condition. You could experience a little bit of spiritual alienation. It's a kind of question. You look at social media, you think, which I think we're partaking in right now, hopefully in a more constructive way. But you can say, hey, human beings can kind of derogate from their own nobility. But Newman's kind of giving courage to those who have that inner voice saying, wait, this isn't all there is there? There's got to be a higher horizon to life. And he wants to follow that pathway exclusively.
Yeah, so in other words, like, conscience then becomes more than just a moral category. It's the natural theology. It's his way to arguing for the existence of God, and it's the preparation for the gospel.
But it's also related. As a student of Aquinas on conscience, when I read Newman, I think in Newman, it's very related to authority. It's like you're looking for a legitimate authority. Right. The world is confusing. How do you find the voice of God within you? How do you find the voice of God externally? And this is part of the reasoning toward Catholicism, not exclusively. It's got to do with this historical past, where it's like more evidential that there's been a coherent revelation across time. But there's also this fact that there's a living authority in the Catholic Church that can coherently navigate through the kind of enterprise of history and the counterwinds of history.
Yeah. So the relationship between conscience and authority is an interesting one. You mentioned the toasting of conscience, conscience first, and so Newman is noted for his primacy of conscience. What does that mean? And I think people take that line of toasting conscience first and the Pope second, and it could be taken in two different directions. I think what Newman really just meant was conscience is primary because it's inviolable. In other words, if someone's commanding you to do something sinful,
you have to freely embrace the faith. You have to freely embrace life with God. You can't do things that are in violence of your conscience.
Yeah, and so even if, for example, a religious superior or the Pope were to command you to do something or ask you to do something that was morally wrong, and your conscience said, don't do it, then you would be obliged to follow your conscience. You're also obliged to follow your conscience, even if it's an erroneous one. But
because
by primacy,
you have to be sincere with what you believe to be the truth.
Right. But by primacy of conscience, Newman did not mean, for example, that the conscience is the final arbiter in all of my personal moral opinions. Especially
because he's writing all against that, saying that the principle of private judgment means that everybody's got their own truth. Actually, what he finds in the church is this public truth about Christ and about the Eucharist and about the Virgin Mary, about the life with God, and it can actually create a communion of persons. So it takes us out of our solitude into relation with others. So I think these things are kind of nuanced.
Yeah. Another way of putting it is that conscience it's not an oracle, it's an organ. It needs to be formed. Right. It can be deformed.
Nicely said.
You can misuse conscience, and the authority of the church is there to actually help form the conscience, especially when it comes to, both are sources of wisdom, both internal and external.
Talking about forming, Newman is informed a lot of the 20th century. Some people talk about him. Ian Kerr famously sort of talked about him as the most important background influence to the Second Vatican Council. Whether or not that's the case, how could we enumerate some of the places we see his influence in 20th century or specifically in the council?
Right. Well, I would say there's two basic things in the council. So he's never mentioned in the councils by name. He's mentioned in the Catechism later on, but I think the two areas is in De Verbum on the Dogmatic Constitutional Revelation, on doctrinal development, and the paragraph on number 8, where it basically says that the church comes to a deeper understanding of the mysteries of faith through, and then it gives 3 reasons. The first one is through contemplation of study, and then it quotes Luke chapter 2, where Mary's contemplating these things in her heart. That's precisely what Newman refers to in his sermon on doctrinal development. He also appeals to Luke chapter 2. And then the second way is through an intimate understanding of things which we experience, or an experiential understanding of spiritual realities, which is kind of what you might refer to as the sensus fidei, or the gifts of the Holy Spirit that help us understand the mysteries of the faith in a more experiential way rather than a more learned or bookish way. And then the third component is through the guidance of the magisterium. So, but that whole understanding of development and Dei Verbum, I think Newman's fingerprints are all over that, albeit mediated
by
through Yves Congar and other people who had read him in the 20th century. And then the second area is ecclesiology. I think in Lumen Gentium, there's a couple places where Newman's fingerprint is, again, Sensus Fidelium, and I think it's Lumen Gentium chapter 12, about the infallibility of the church as a whole, from the layperson to the Pope, that we cannot err, that the faithful cannot err in matters.
And you are a lay theologian, and Newman wrote about the place of the laity in the church, just with some controversy. Or very early on as a Catholic, he sort of went into this controversial stance that the laity have a major contribution to make the life of the church. It's something also Congar took up in his famous book about laity that also then affected the Second Vatican Council.
Right.
So, I mean, what should we say about that?
Yeah, so in the late 50s, he was asked to become an editor of a magazine because they thought that it would not go on, or there were some problems with it. And so the hierarchy asked him to become the editor, and then he ended up writing an article that also got himself in trouble, basically on consulting the laity in matters of doctrine. And in it, he basically shows that there were periods in the church where it was actually the laity who safeguarded the faith better than the bishops, in particular, for example, in the 4th and 5th centuries during the Arian crisis.
Okay, so this is obviously a delicate point to, make a parallelism, but on all these controversies around synodality today, where there's the desire to consult the laity, and of course you have a whole branch of the church, for example, in Germany today, who want to, in some sense, very overtly, very intentionally and clearly reposition the church's teaching in a lot of ways through consulting the laity and so forth. I mean, how does that influence from Newman affect, or does it have anything to say directly, or do we have to extrapolate? I mean,
yeah, I think the first thing to just consider are all of Newman's examples and on consulting. I mean, his primary examples of the faithful or the laity in terms of their adherence to doctrine is their fidelity to what has been defined. So when a lay person sees an Arian bishop, they're all in the baths, for example, and they see the Arian bishop come in, they leave the baths, right? And then the Arian bishop says, oh, well, maybe it's me, so maybe I'll leave, and then they'll come back in. And then Newman says, well, no, they actually had to empty the water out because they thought it was contaminated by Arian heresy. 4th
century examples of the laity stridently defending the divinity of Christ. So they're so committed to the church's Nicene Creed that they don't want to even be in the same place as the Arian bishop.
It's a jealousy of error is what Newman called it, like an extreme aversion to error.
Okay, but so you're saying that
what I'm saying is basically that's like one of the primary examples. You list example of lay people having an aversion to doctrinal error and fidelity to to the Nicene Creed. And I think the difference between that, for example, and appeals today to the laity are stark. I mean, for example, there's the difference between, say, assimilating something in the culture or accepting something that lay people or a majority of lay people want or clamoring for on the one hand, and lay people who are exhibiting a fidelity to the church's faith.
Well, I certainly know lay people who I think are exemplary in their fidelity and their life of holiness and service to Christ in the church. But I guess I could ask by provocation, is Newman being a little bit romantic here, that the sort of docile sheep of the laity all really believe, and some of the clerics and religious and laity and the bishops are sort of more the lazy, spiritually lazy people, but thank God for the laity? Or, I mean, do you think he's got a mixed view that you have good and bad, or a range of intensity of commitment in all these parts of the church?
There's definitely a range of intensity, but I think the first thing to note is just the interaction or the mutual relationship between the magisterium and the laity. That the laity don't have the faith unless they're given the faith, and yet it's not simply passive, because once a lay person or any Christian, by virtue of one's baptism, regardless of whether you're religious, ordained, whatever, it doesn't matter, but through baptism, once you have the faith, it can bear fruit. You can penetrate that doctrine. You can try to understand it more deeply, and you can make a contribution to growth.
You mentioned Chesterton earlier, who's just right after Newman generationally and became this incredibly powerful public and international exponent of the Catholic faith through his vociferous and brilliant, writing. And, I think that the thing is that since that time, we now have really seen the laity enter into the world of theology, certainly in the English-speaking world. And they have, at least, I'd say, well, an equal or majority share in the communication of the faith in academic theology. So, okay, good transition point. Newman and Education, another famous book he wrote on the idea of the university.
Right.
Newman has a whole vision. He was sent initially to Ireland to found a university. He writes a very important book that still is seen as one of the most coherent and profound visions of what modern university education is. I mean, is it, to what extent for Newman, does the university need God to be a university? That's one way to put a provocative question. Or to what extent can the university have secular disciplines that sort of stand on their own and don't need theology to justify themselves?
Right. So, like, to briefly answer your point, a university that in principle excludes one discipline is not a university. In other words, a university needs theology, at least in principle. If it a priori says we can do without it, then he says it's not really a university, because university aspires to universal knowledge. And so there's a circle of knowledge made up of all the different disciplines. And if you take one out, the other disciplines will creep in and they'll take over. And then you get a warped view of reality.
What if the subject being excluded, it relates you to the reality that is the source of all other reality? That could also affect how you judge all the other realities studied in all the other disciplines. Now, I'm speaking now as a theologian, very
Absolutely.
aggressively.
Absolutely. No, so
it's interesting though. So he clearly respects all the lesser disciplines as he would see them, and he very strongly respects philosophy as having its own autonomy vis-a-vis theology. But he's got a point that, like, once you exclude anything from the genuine universe of knowledge, you're going to, in a way, reduce the meaning of what it is to seek universal knowledge and change the definition, essentially. I mean, I think it's also quite significant to think, like, the source of the universe that we study universally in a university is himself studied by one discipline above all others. And when you exclude that discipline, as has happened, of course, in most universities today, it's not clear you can really gain purchase on the most ultimate intelligibility that undergirds all things, put it gently.
that's right. So there is actually, for all of Newman's non-metaphysical turn of mind, he actually is quite metaphysical here, I think, in terms of understanding that knowledge is ultimately one, and that the source of that unity of knowledge is actually God, and that you cannot exclude the study of God and also claim to have universal knowledge in any way. But it also works, the dynamic also is reversed,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So there are some universities who might think that, well, we don't need the sciences, or we don't need this or
As
that.
long as you've got God, you've got everything. And he's definitely not of that perspective.
Not that. And I think for, like, contemporary universities, liberal arts colleges who might not have, for example, a biology faculty or something, or for Pontifical University that might not have all the natural sciences, I think the key thing is that one is open in principle to the universal gamut of knowledge.
I mean, Newman was very much an Oxfordian in the sense that he really believed in the mathematical and empirical sciences. He really believed in the place of logic and philosophy, history, and of following evidence where it leads. But he also had that old Anglican idea that this could all be, in a certain way, brought under the aegis of divine wisdom and classical humanities learning also.
But I mean, the idea of universal knowledge raises the question, why? To what end? And I think the point of the university for Newman is ultimately education. And by education, I think one of his major contributions is his attention to intellectual virtue. What does it mean to be intellectually well-rounded?
And he distinguishes the, the serviable arts from the liberal arts, where
you... He
says, like,
servile arts,
Servile. So, like, being a lawyer or a doctor is very noble, but it's ultimately an education ordered toward practical activity, subordinate to something higher, which he calls in the liberal arts, where you're really studying truth for its own sake. Very controversial claim today, strangely. I mean, I think when I was in the Ivy League in the 90s, that was still absolutely kind of, well, it was a defensible point of view.
It's still,
It's been pretty eclipsed now. I think your mind has to be useful if you're going to have a mind these days.
That's right.
As opposed to uselessly contemplating the truth, as it were.
Yeah. So in Newman, you find a great defender of the liberal arts, and that ought not to be taken, however, to be. He was never indifferent to research. So some people think of Newman and the idea of university as kind of like an excuse not to have to research. Whereas Newman he wrote a lot. There was the Atlantis, a journal for the Catholic University of Ireland. So he wanted his colleagues to publish. But I think the other issue here is just intellectual virtue and trying to avoid these two extremes or two vices, you might say. One is like the viewy person, the person who has these superficial views on the one hand, and then the man of one idea, he calls it, the guy who just rides one horse all the time and can only view things through his one point of view. And so the whole point of a universal knowledge is so that someone is educated holistically and can
And I
view
mean,
things at
Newman's
their core.
always taking on the challenges of whatever conversation he's in from all comers with a tremendous amount of intellectual, not just charity, but genuine openness. I mean, he adopts. It's almost sometimes when he writes, like from a secular perspective, it's incredibly powerful because he can kind of articulate a position antithetical to that of Christianity with a tremendous forcefulness,
Yeah.
which I think shows the generosity of his mind.
Well, it shows also he was a man of his time. So he knew the way people thought. He wasn't a stick in the mud. I think that's one of the reasons why he's going to be so effective as a doctor of the church is ultimately because he believed things that were countercultural on the one hand, but he communicated them and he knew the culture to which he was speaking. So his ability to express someone else's point of view and to do so, he wasn't in an educated way, in a nuanced way, in a balanced way, in an accurate way that everyone could identify. Yeah, I know that person whom he's talking about. That's something that shows his effectiveness as a
Yeah, it's very
communicator.
gritty at the same time as it's very deep. So that brings us, about universities and being present in the culture. We can come back to this chair for John Henry Newman studies that you now occupy at the Angelicum. And although I think I've been involved in crafting this with you, why don't we ask you what do you foresee for that chair? What do you see as its importance, and what can you tell us a little bit about your plans for what you would like to do in terms of promoting Newman in the Eternal City at the Angelicum?
Yeah, well, I suppose the end goal ultimately is to foster and cultivate Newman studies and to open up Newman to people who might not, for example, be familiar with him. There's quite a bit of challenges in terms of Newman studies because a little bit like Aquinas, you have to know something about the 19th century context in order to understand him. His prose is not always easy. And so
It's
not,
glorious.
yeah,
It's glorious. Not easy, but
it's
glorious.
not always glorious.
One of the greatest writers of English prose.
Yeah. But so he has so much to offer. And so the way is to ultimately to kind of cultivate people who study him, to work with him, and then to insert him within the bigger Catholic tradition. I think if you just go into Newman studies alone, I think Newman would have an aversion to that. He would bristle at that. But to see Newman as one member of a larger Catholic
So the
tradition,
doctors of the church talk to each other, don't
they,
they? And
absolutely,
I mean,
yeah,
when you listen to them co-simultaneously, harmonies and polyphonies emerge, and it's one way in which you can appreciate each of them more. And I think that that's really important. That at a university that's named for St. Thomas Aquinas, and that name wasn't given by the Dominican order; it was given by the Pope to promote the thought of the common doctor in Rome. It's also important that we're dedicated to listening to other voices with complementary, sometimes overlapping, sometimes slightly different visions that invite us to think about the whole Catholic communion in the truth and the different visions, voices, spiritual experiences, and intellectual conceptualities that go into making up the life of the church. And I think that it's often good for a student, I find, for a student of theology to have at least 2 or 3 major interlocutors in their life, if not more, so that they're learning a little bit like learning different languages or different musical instruments. You can express yourself in different ways. And Newman's a great complement to, say, Augustine or Bonaventure or Aquinas or other influential figures. So I really hope that this project can help people discover that dimension of Catholic understanding.
yeah. Also, I mean, to see how different contexts, different points of view can actually harmonize or can be synthesized. And sometimes you just have to sit with things that are just different. And I think part of a kind of a mature Catholic intellectual life is the ability to identify those places where things sit together well and some places where they don't sit together well. And that might be okay. And you just have to kind of put up with it and then try to find some higher synthesis
Well,
elsewhere.
yeah, it can make us think a lot more. I mean, the church, as Newman's telling us, the church moves forward in developmental reflection, and listening to the great people from the past invites us to think about how we should articulate the faith in the future.
I mean, Newman himself had a profound respect for scholasticism, for Thomas Aquinas. There's a whole set of doctorates there about Newman and scholasticism that I think could be done. There's interesting stuff there, how you read the Baroque scholastics as well. So he would be the last one to try to streamline everything into one line. He obviously felt most at home with the church fathers, but when he became Catholic, he discovered and respected deeply the scholastic tradition, even if he himself knew that he wasn't raised in it, he wasn't trained in it. It wasn't his first protocol, as it were, but he definitely had respect for it.
So, Professor Meszaros, another thing I would just like to ask you about is that you have been asked to be a consultor for the process of vetting John Henry Newman as a doctor of the church on the part of the Holy See. I mean, many people are consulted, but I think you have something with us today that shows a little bit what the process looks like in its
Sure.
culmination.
Absolutely. So this big red book here, it's called the Positio, and it was basically lots of people were involved, but essentially it's about 20 theologians who made contributions to the most important chapter in here. So this book is made up of a lot of different things. The most important one is the last chapter called The Eminence of Doctrine, that tries to show that Newman's doctrine is eminent, it's noteworthy, not only orthodox, but that it actually relevant, has something to say for us today, that is worthy of recognition.
And you wrote the part on what?
I wrote the chapter on theological faith.
And you think Newman had faith? Is that your conclusion?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he had faith. I believe he had faith.
Supernatural faith. No, you wrote about his teaching on supernatural
His teaching,
faith.
yeah, in particular, faith and reason as well. The relationship between faith and
right,
reason.
'cause
And
he wrote a
theological
lot
faith.
about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
And so once this book was kind of put together, then it was submitted to a dicastery, or maybe multiple dicasteries, and then they made a positive recommendation to the Pope, and the Pope has declared that he will become a doctor of the church.
now, they probably made the recommendation under Pope Francis, or do you think it happened under Pope Leo?
That's a good question. I think it was already underway under Pope Francis for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure. Yeah.
I don't know the exact timing.
I
of
was,
things.
I mean, as rector of the Angelicum, I was asked with the other rectors of the Roman universities. We were invited to write letters, and that was some year, like at least a year and a half ago, I think. So they've been gathering. They got a lot of bishops' conferences have all been invited to write in. So it's like they want to consult. They're consulting at various levels and seeing if there's a kind of common consent, a sensus fidei. So it's something Newman himself kind of wrote about.
Yeah, so it can't be something imposed from. They always want to see, is like in the canonization of a saint, you always want to make sure that there's a cult. Is there a following? Is there a clamoring for something like this? And so the bishops of England and Wales started the clamoring, and then people joined their voices to the English bishops and seconded it. And so the first half of it is basically all the letters of people clamoring for this to happen. And then the second half of it
the
is
more thematic arguments.
the theological, the substance of his teaching, and does it constitute eminent doctrine?
Right. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Angelicum Conversations. They are conversations on theology, philosophy, and culture that are centered at the Angelicum in the Eternal City. We hope to have other noteworthy scholars like Professor Meszaros present. Please feel free to like and follow us in the link below, and we hope to see you again. Also, never hesitate to reach out to us by email to let us know what you would like to see us present to you online. We are excited about this new project. Thanks so much.